What happens when a man who's spent 15 years running from noise, from people, from the chaos of caring about anyone, suddenly finds his sanctuary invaded by the one thing he swore he'd never let back into his life? This is the story of Jake Morrison, a cowboy who thought silence was salvation, until a broken-down truck and a woman with a guitar taught him that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the very thing we're most afraid to hear, the sound of home. But before we begin, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us where you're listening from. The Texas sun had been merciless that July morning in 1950, beating down on the dusty expanse of the Morrison Ranch like God's own hammer on an anvil. Jake Morrison pulled his weathered Stetson lower over his eyes, the brim casting his shadow across features that hadn't seen a genuine smile in more years than he cared to count. At 35, his hands were already maps of hard labor, scarred knuckles, calloused palms, and fingers that knew the weight of rope and leather better than they knew the touch of another human being. The ranch stretched out before him like a brown sea, broken only by the occasional mesquite tree and the distant outline of the old farmhouse where he'd been born. It was his now, had been since his father passed 2 winters back, leaving him with 3,000 acres of solitude and a silence so profound it had become his religion. The sound hit Jake's ears like a slap at dawn, the grinding, coughing death rattle of an engine giving up its ghost somewhere along the dirt road that bordered his property. He'd been mending fence since sunrise, sweat already darkening his blue work shirt despite the early hour, when the mechanical symphony of automotive failure shattered his morning peace. "Damn," he muttered, straightening his back with a grimace. His spine protested the movement, a reminder of too many years breaking horses and hauling feed. The sound came again, metal grinding against metal, followed by what sounded distinctly like a woman's voice raised in what his grandmother would have called unladylike language. Jake's first instinct was to ignore it. Wasn't his problem if some fool tourist had taken the back road and gotten themselves stranded. The main highway was only 10 miles north, and surely someone else would come along eventually. He returned to his fence post, driving the wire staples with perhaps more force than necessary. But the cursing continued, growing more creative and considerably louder. Despite himself, Jake found his mouth twitching at some of the combinations. Whoever she was, she had a vocabulary that would make a drill sergeant proud and a voice that carried across the plains like music, even when she was mad as a wet cat. 20 minutes passed. The cursing had stopped, replaced by something worse, singing. Not just any singing, but a voice so pure and haunting it seemed to make the very air shimmer. Jake dropped his hammer, the tool landing in the dust with a dull thud that seemed unnaturally loud in the wake of that melody. He tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the fence, on the cattle moving lazy through the distant pasture, on anything but the way that voice seemed to reach inside his chest and squeeze. But the song continued, something slow and mournful about trains and leaving and hearts that ached with the weight of miles. "Jesus," Jake breathed, and before he knew what he was doing, his boots were carrying him toward the road. The truck was a 1940 Ford, painted a faded blue that might have been cheerful once, but now looked tired as yesterday's coffee. Steam rose from under the hood in wispy spirals, and Jake could smell the sweet scent of coolant mixing with the dusty air. The tailgate was down, and sitting on it was the source of both the cursing and the singing. She was small, couldn't be more than 5'3", with dark hair that had escaped whatever attempt she'd made to tame it that morning. Her dress was simple cotton, the kind you could buy at any Woolworths, but it fit her like it had been made special. An old guitar sat across her lap, its finish worn smooth by years of handling, and her fingers moved across the strings with the kind of easy confidence that spoke of a lifetime's practice. When she saw him approaching, she stopped singing but didn't move from her perch. Her eyes were the color of Texas sky just before a storm, gray-blue and full of electricity. "You lost, miss?" Jake asked, stopping a respectable distance away. Up close, he could see she was maybe 25, with the kind of face that was pretty without trying to be, and laugh lines around her eyes that suggested she did it often. "Not lost," she replied, her voice carrying just a hint of Arkansas in its drawl. "Just temporarily immobilized. This old girl decided she'd had enough about a quarter mile back." She patted the truck's tailgate affectionately. Can't say I blame her. We've been on the road for 3 days straight. Where you headed? San Antonio. Got a job lined up at a club there. 3 nights a week, decent pay. And they don't mind if I do my own songs instead of just the popular stuff. She gestured to the guitar. Trouble is, Bessie here seems to think this is as far as we need to go. Jake glanced at the truck, Bessie, apparently, and could see the problem immediately. The radiator hose had given way, probably from the heat and age. It was fixable, but not easily, and not quickly. You got people expecting you? He asked. Just the club owner, and not till tomorrow night. Figure I can camp out here tonight, if I need to. Wouldn't be the first time. She said it matter-of-factly, but Jake caught something in her tone, a wariness that spoke of experience, with less than ideal accommodations. The decent thing would be to offer help. The smart thing would be to point her toward town, and the nearest mechanic. Jake Morrison had been doing the smart thing for 15 years, ever since he'd learned that caring about people just gave life more ways to hurt you. But something about the way she sat there, not asking for help, but not complaining either, just accepting whatever came next with that guitar in her lap, like it was all the security she needed in the world. Something about that got under his skin like a splinter. House is about a mile up the road, he heard himself saying. Got a spare room and a phone. You can call for a tow in the morning. She studied him for a long moment, those storm-colored eyes taking in his face, his posture, probably calculating whether he was the kind of man who made offers he expected payment for. That's kind of you, she said finally. I'm Rose Delacroix, and I promise I'm not the kind of house guest who'll steal your silver or burn down your kitchen. Jake Morrison, and I don't have any silver worth stealing. For the first time since he'd walked up, she smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face and made Jake's chest do something he'd forgotten it was capable of. Then I guess we're even, she said, sliding down from the tailgate with an easy grace. Lead the way, Jake Morrison. As they walked toward his truck, Rose carrying her guitar and a worn canvas bag that seemed to contain all her worldly possessions, Jake wondered what in the hell he'd just gotten himself into. The silence he'd worked so hard to cultivate seemed to be cracking already, filled with the sound of her boots on gravel and the soft humming she'd started up again. Something cheerful this time that made the morning feel lighter somehow. He told himself it was just one night, and then she'd be gone, taking her music and her storm-colored eyes and that smile that seemed to light up the world. His silence would return, and everything would go back to normal. But as Rose Delacroix settled into the passenger seat of his truck and started talking about the town she'd seen and the people she'd met, Jake Morrison began to suspect that normal was about to become a thing of the past. The Morrison Ranch house had been built in 1889 by Jake's grandfather, a man who believed in solid construction and practical comfort over fancy flourishes. It was a 2-story structure of local limestone and oak, weathered by decades of Texas sun and wind into something that looked like it had grown from the earth itself. Wide porches wrapped around 3 sides, offering shade and a place to sit during the cooler parts of the day, though Jake couldn't remember the last time he'd used them for anything but storing feed sacks and broken equipment. As they pulled up the circular drive, Rose leaned forward in her seat, taking in the house with obvious appreciation. It's beautiful, she said, and Jake was surprised by how much her approval meant to him. How long has your family been here? Going on 60 years, Jake replied, cutting the engine. The sudden silence felt different with her in it, not empty, but full of potential. My grandfather started with 500 acres and a stubborn streak. Built it up from there. And now it's just you. The question was gently asked, but it hit Jake like a physical blow. Just him. 3,000 acres of prime Texas ranch land, a house built for a family, and just him rattling around in it like a dried pea in a gourd. Just me, he confirmed, climbing out of the truck. The guest room was on the first floor, originally intended as a sewing room for the lady of the house. Jake's mother had used it for that purpose until her death when he was 16, and it had sat empty ever since. Now, as he opened the door and gestured Rose inside, Jake was acutely aware of how dusty and unused everything looked. I'll get you some clean sheets, he said, suddenly embarrassed by the state of things. "Don't fuss on my account," Rose said, setting her guitar case carefully against the wall. "I've stayed in places that would make this look like the Ritz. Besides, a little dust never hurt anybody." But Jake was already moving, driven by some half-remembered notion of hospitality that his mother had tried to instill in him. He found sheets that didn't smell too much of storage, towels that were only slightly yellowed with age, and even managed to coax some lukewarm water from the kitchen pump for the wash basin. By the time he'd finished his preparations, Rose had unpacked her few belongings and was sitting on the front porch, guitar in hand, picking out a melody that seemed to dance with the evening breeze. Jake stood in the doorway, struck by how right she looked there, how the house seemed to come alive around her presence. "You eat yet today?" he asked, and was rewarded with another of those transformative smiles. "Not since this morning. You offering to cook? Or should I see what I can rustle up?" "I can manage," Jake said, though the truth was his culinary skills extended mainly to coffee, eggs, and whatever could be thrown together from canned goods. Nothing fancy. "Fancy's overrated," Rose said, standing and following him into the kitchen. "Mind if I help? I promise I'm more useful in a kitchen than I am under the hood of a truck." The kitchen was large and old-fashioned, with a wood-burning stove that Jake had converted to propane and cabinets his grandfather had built by hand. Rose moved through it with easy familiarity, finding ingredients Jake had forgotten he owned and turning them into something that actually resembled a proper meal. "So what's a traveling musician doing alone on the back roads of Texas?" Jake asked as they worked side by side, Rose chopping vegetables while he fumbled with the ancient can opener. "Same thing a rancher's doing alone in a house built for a family, I'd guess," Rose replied without looking up from her work. "Running from something, running to something, or maybe just running because standing still hurts too much." Jake's hand stilled on the can opener. In 15 years of careful conversation and deliberate solitude, no one had ever seen through him so clearly or stated it so simply. "Which one are you?" he asked. "All three, depending on the day." Rose scraped the vegetables into the pan with a satisfying sizzle. "You." Jake considered lying, giving her the same polite deflection he'd perfected over the years. Instead, he found himself saying, "The first one mostly. Though I've been doing it so long I sometimes forget what I was running from." Rose nodded as if this made perfect sense. "That's the trouble with running. Eventually, you get so good at it you forget why you started." They cooked in comfortable silence after that, a silence different from the oppressive quiet Jake had grown accustomed to. This silence was companionable, filled with the sounds of food preparing and the awareness of another person moving through the space. It reminded Jake of childhood evenings when his mother would hum while she cooked and his father would read the paper at the kitchen table, the three of them existing in their own small universe of domestic contentment. After dinner, they sat on the front porch as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful to be real. Rose had brought her guitar out again, and her fingers moved across the strings in patterns that seemed to match the rhythm of the cicadas beginning their evening chorus. "Play something," Jake found himself saying. Rose looked at him with surprise. "You sure? Most folks have had enough of my music by the time the sun goes down." "I'm sure." She considered for a moment, then began to play. Not the mournful song from earlier, but something softer, more intimate. A song about home and the people who make it, about the way love can grow in the most unexpected places, quiet as grass, and just as persistent. Jake listened with his eyes closed, feeling something inside him that had been locked away for years beginning to stir. The music seemed to fill spaces in his chest he'd forgotten existed, warming places that had grown cold from disuse. When the song ended, Rose set the guitar aside, and they sat in the gathering darkness, watching the first stars appear in the Texas sky. "You know," Rose said eventually, "this is the first time in months I've sat still long enough to actually watch the sunset. Amazing what you miss when you're always moving." "Amazing what you miss when you're always standing still too," Jake replied, and was rewarded with one of her soft laughs. "Seems like we might have something to teach each other then." Jake turned to look at her. taking in her profile silhouetted against the last light of day. Something was happening here. Something he'd sworn he'd never let happen again. But sitting here with Rose Delacroix, listening to her music and her laughter and the way she spoke about life like it was an adventure worth taking, Jake Morrison began to think that maybe, just maybe, some risks were worth taking. "Maybe we do," he said quietly. Rose turned to meet his gaze, and in her storm-colored eyes, Jake saw something that both terrified and thrilled him. The possibility of a future he'd never allowed himself to imagine. Jake woke before dawn, as was his habit, but lay in bed listening to sounds he'd forgotten a house could make with another person in it. The soft creak of floorboards as Rose moved around the guest room, the distant sound of water running, the low humming that seemed to be her constant companion. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. He found her in the kitchen, already dressed and with coffee brewing on the stove. She'd found his mother's old apron, a cheerful yellow thing with tiny flowers that Jake hadn't seen in 20 years, and had it tied around her waist as she worked at the counter. "Hope you don't mind," she said without turning around. "I'm an early riser, and I figured I owed you breakfast after that dinner. Found some eggs and what might generously be called bacon in your icebox." "Don't mind at all," Jake said, and realized he meant it. The sight of her moving around his kitchen, humming softly to herself, filled him with a contentment he'd thought was lost to him forever. Over breakfast, Rose told him about her travels, the small towns and big cities, the clubs and honky-tonks, the people she'd met, and the songs they'd inspired. She spoke about music the way some people spoke about religion, with a reverence that made Jake understand it wasn't just what she did, but who she was. "What about you?" she asked as they lingered over their coffee. "You always been a rancher?" Jake found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone, about his plans to study engineering before his father's first heart attack, about the woman he'd almost married before the war, about the dreams he'd packed away like old clothes that no longer fit. "You ever think about leaving?" Rose asked, "Seeing what else is out there?" "Used to," Jake admitted. "But this place, it's in my blood, I guess. Been Morrison land for 3 generations. Seems wrong to let it go just because I got restless." Rose nodded, but Jake caught something in her expression, a flicker of understanding mixed with what might have been disappointment. After breakfast, they drove out to check on Rose's truck. In the harsh light of morning, the damage looked worse than it had the evening before. The radiator hose wasn't just cracked, it had split completely, and Jake could see other problems developing. Worn belts, a battery that was probably on its last legs, tires that were more hope than rubber. "Well," Rose said with forced cheerfulness, "looks like Bessie's finally decided to retire." "Might be fixable," Jake offered, though they both knew it would cost more than the truck was worth. Rose ran her hand along the truck's faded paint with the tenderness of someone saying goodbye to an old friend. "She's been good to me. Carried me from Arkansas to California and back again more times than I can count. But I think she's earned her rest." They arranged for the truck to be towed to the junkyard in town, and Jake drove Rose to the general store where she could call the club in San Antonio. He waited outside, listening to her explain the situation to someone on the other end of the line, her voice carefully professional even as Jake could see the disappointment in her posture. "Well," he asked when she emerged. "They can't wait," Rose said simply. "Got another girl lined up who can start tonight. It's business, I understand that, but it means I'm officially stranded until I can figure out my next move." Jake should have offered to drive her to San Antonio. Should have helped her find another job, another opportunity. Should have done the decent thing and helped her continue on her way. Instead, he heard himself saying, "The offer stands. Stay as long as you need to." Rose studied his face for a long moment. "That's generous, Jake, but I can't just live off your charity indefinitely. I need to earn my keep somehow." "Town's got a church social this Saturday," Jake found himself saying. "They're always looking for entertainment. Probably doesn't pay much, but it's something." For the first time since they discovered the extent of Bessie's problems, Rose smiled. "I haven't played a church social since I was 16. Think they'd mind if my repertoire includes a few songs about whiskey and broken hearts?" "Depends on how you present them," Jake said, surprised by his own grin. That evening, Rose convinced Jake to bring out his father's old guitar, a beautiful Martin that had been gathering dust in the closet for 2 decades. Jake's fingers were clumsy on the strings at first, muscle memory fighting against years of disuse. But gradually the chords came back to him. "You're not half bad," Rose said as they played together on the front porch, her voice blending with his in a harmony that seemed to have been waiting years to be discovered. "Used to play with my dad," Jake admitted. "Before the war, before everything got complicated. Haven't touched it since he died." "Music's like love," Rose said softly. "Hurts like hell when you lose it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't worth having." Jake's fingers stilled on the strings. "You sound like you speak from experience." Rose was quiet for so long that Jake thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the evening breeze. "I was married once. Tommy Delacroix married me when I was 18 and he was 22. Both of us full of dreams and sure we could conquer the world together. He wanted to be a songwriter, and I wanted to sing. We were going to go to Nashville, make it big." "What happened?" "Korea happened. He got drafted 6 months after we married, and I was going to wait for him. Wrote him letters every day. Kept working on my music. Kept our dreams alive for both of us." Rose's voice caught slightly. "He made it through most of his tour. Died 3 weeks before he was supposed to come home." Jake set his guitar aside and reached for her hand without thinking. Her fingers were cold despite the warm evening air. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. "Been 5 years now," Rose continued. "I kept his name because it felt like letting go of the last piece of him if I didn't. But I realized I'd been carrying his dreams instead of my own for so long I'd forgotten what mine looked like." "Is that why you're traveling? Trying to figure it out?" Rose nodded. "Problem is, every time I start to settle somewhere, start to care about people, it feels like I'm betraying what Tommy and I had. Like if I'm happy without him, it means what we had wasn't real." Jake understood that particular brand of guilt better than he cared to admit. "You think that's what he would have wanted? For you to stop living?" "Logically, no. Tommy would be the first one to tell me I'm being stubborn and foolish. But logic doesn't have much to do with grief, does it?" They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Rose picked up her guitar again and began to play. Something slow and sweet that spoke of love found and lost and the courage it took to hope for it again. As the last notes faded into the night air, Jake realized something had shifted between them. The walls they'd both built around their hearts had developed cracks, and something fragile but real was beginning to grow in the spaces between. "Rose," he said softly. She turned to look at him, and in the moonlight, her eyes held a question he wasn't sure either of them was ready to answer. "Nothing," he said finally. "Just, I'm glad your truck broke down." Rose smiled, a smile that was part sadness, part hope, and entirely beautiful. "Me too," she whispered. The church social on Saturday night was everything Jake had expected, and nothing like he'd prepared for. The entire population of Cedar Ridge seemed to have turned out for the event, cramming into the parish hall with its creaking wooden floors and hand-painted banners announcing the annual summer social and talent show. Jake hadn't been to one of these gatherings in years, and he'd forgotten how the whole town could transform into something resembling a large, occasionally dysfunctional family. Rose had spent the week preparing, working up arrangements of familiar hymns alongside carefully chosen secular songs that wouldn't shock the more conservative members of the congregation. Jake had watched her practice each evening on the front porch, her voice growing stronger and more confident as she found her rhythm again. Now, as she took the small stage that had been erected at one end of the hall, Jake felt his heart hammering against his ribs with a nervousness that had nothing to do with stage fright and everything to do with the knowledge that after tonight, everything would change. Rose had borrowed a dress from Mrs. Henderson at the general store, a simple blue number that brought out her eyes and made her look like she belonged in this room full of farmers and shopkeepers and their families. She adjusted the microphone with the easy confidence of someone who'd performed in front of far more intimidating audiences than this one. "Good evening, everyone," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I'm Rose Delacroix, and I'm honored to be here with you tonight. Jake Morrison was kind enough to invite me, and I thought I'd share a few songs that have been keeping me company on the road." She started with amazing grace, her voice pure and strong, and Jake watched as the entire room seemed to lean forward, drawn in by the beauty of it. But it was her second song, a tender ballad about finding home in unexpected places, that had Jake's breath catching in his throat. Because as she sang, Rose's eyes found his across the crowded room, and he knew with absolute certainty that she was singing about him, about them, about the impossible thing that had been growing between them all week. The applause when she finished was thunderous, and Jake felt a surge of pride that caught him off guard. This woman, this talented, beautiful, complicated woman, had chosen to share her gift with his neighbors, with his community, had chosen to stay here with him when she could have been anywhere else in the world. After her performance, Rose was surrounded by well-wishers and new admirers, but her eyes kept finding Jake's across the room. When she finally made her way back to his side, her cheeks were flushed with excitement and something that looked like relief. "That was incredible," Jake said, and meant it. "I knew you were talented, but seeing you up there, it felt good," Rose admitted. "I'd forgotten what it was like to perform for people who weren't just background noise in a bar, people who actually listened." Old Mrs. Patterson, who'd been the church pianist for 40 years, appeared at Rose's elbow with tears in her eyes. "My dear, that was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years. You have a gift from the Lord, and no mistake." "Thank you," Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." As the evening wound down and the cleanup began, Jake found himself working alongside Rose to stack chairs and sweep floors, moving in the kind of easy synchronization that spoke of partnership. It was domestic and simple, and exactly the kind of life Jake had convinced himself he didn't need. The drive home was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they were sitting on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear Texas sky, that Rose finally broke the silence. "Jake," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." Jake's heart clenched. He'd been expecting this, the inevitable moment when she would tell him she was leaving, moving on to the next town, the next opportunity. He'd been a fool to think she would stay. "I got a call yesterday," Rose continued, "from a club owner in Austin. Someone at the social tonight has a cousin who heard me perform somewhere else, and word got around. They want me to audition." "That's wonderful," Jake managed, though the words felt like ground glass in his throat. "Austin's got a real music scene. It's what you've been looking for." Rose turned to face him fully, her storm-colored eyes serious in the moonlight. "Is it, though? Because I've been thinking all week about what I actually want, and I'm not sure it's what I thought it was." Jake didn't dare to hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've spent 5 years running from place to place, telling myself I was chasing dreams, when really I was just running from the possibility of getting hurt again. But this week, being here with you, it's made me remember what it feels like to have a home instead of just a place to sleep." Jake's heart was beating so hard he was sure she could hear it. "Rose, I know it's crazy," she rushed on. "I know we've only known each other a week, and I know you've got your own reasons for keeping people at arm's length. But what if we stopped running? What if we tried building something together instead of protecting ourselves from everything that could go wrong?" Jake stared at her, seeing in her face the same terrified hope he felt building in his own chest. For years, he'd told himself that solitude was safety, that caring about someone was just setting himself up for inevitable loss. But looking at Rose now, this brave, beautiful woman who was offering him her heart despite every reason she had to protect it, Jake realized that safety was just another word for slowly dying. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said quietly, "about stopping running, about what it might be like to have someone to share all this with." He gestured at the ranch spread out before them in the moonlight, someone to build a life with instead of just getting through each day. Rose's smile was radiant. "So what do we do about it?" Jake reached for her hand, feeling the calluses on her fingertips from years of guitar playing, the strength in her grip that spoke of resilience and determination. "Well," he said, "I reckon we start by admitting we're scared as hell, but willing to try anyway. And then we take it one day at a time and see what we can build together." Rose laughed, a sound full of joy and relief and infinite possibility. "I love you, Jake Morrison. I know it's too soon to say it and too fast to feel it, but I do." "I love you too," Jake replied, and felt something that had been frozen inside him for 15 years finally begin to thaw. "God help us both, but I do." When they kissed under the Texas stars, it tasted like coming home and starting over all at the same time. And for the first time since he was 20 years old, Jake Morrison began to believe that some prayers were answered not with what you asked for, but with what you never knew you needed. 1 year later, the sound of laughter drifted across the ranch on the warm October evening, carried on a breeze that smelled of barbecue smoke and the last wildflowers of the season. Jake stood on the front porch, watching as Rose taught his neighbor's daughter how to hold a guitar properly, their heads bent together in concentration. The Morrison Ranch had changed over the past year in ways both subtle and profound. The house had been painted, the gardens replanted, and the old barn had been converted into a performance space where Rose taught music lessons and hosted small concerts for the community. But the biggest change was in the sound of the place, no longer the oppressive silence of isolation, but the comfortable symphony of a life being lived in harmony with another person. Rose had turned down the job in Austin, choosing instead to build something new right here in Cedar Ridge. She performed regularly at churches and community events throughout the county, and her music lessons had become so popular that she was considering hiring an assistant. But more than that, she'd become part of the fabric of the community in a way that Jake had never quite managed in 35 years of living here. "You going to stand there admiring your wife all evening, or are you going to help us get this barbecue ready?" called Tom Henderson from beside the smoking grill, his voice full of good-natured teasing. Jake grinned, still feeling a small thrill at the word wife. They'd married in the spring in the same church where Rose had first performed, with half the county in attendance and Mrs. Patterson playing the wedding march with tears streaming down her cheeks. As Jake joined the small gathering of friends and neighbors in their backyard, he caught Rose's eye across the yard. She was still working with little Emily Henderson, but she looked up and smiled at him, the same transformative smile that had changed his life a year ago when a broken truck and a woman with a guitar had invaded his carefully constructed solitude. Later, after the guests had gone home and the dishes were washed and put away, Jake and Rose sat on their front porch swing, a wedding gift from the congregation, and watched the stars appear in the clear Texas sky. "You know what I realized today?" Rose said, her head resting against Jake's shoulder. "What's that?" "I used to think music was about the song itself, the melody, the words, the performance. But it's not really. It's about the spaces between the notes, the silence that gives the music meaning." Jake pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and the night-blooming jasmine they'd planted by the porch steps. "And what does that have to do with today?" he asked. Rose was quiet for a moment, her fingers finding his and intertwining with them. "Just that I spent so many years afraid of the silence, thinking it meant emptiness or loneliness. But silence with you isn't empty at all. It's full of possibility, full of love, full of all the music we're going to make together." Jake squeezed her hand, feeling the truth of her words settle into his bones like a blessing. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, isolated, afraid, convinced that safety lay in keeping the world at arm's length. That man had prayed for silence and gotten exactly what he'd asked for, not realizing that what he'd really been praying for was this: a love so complete it could transform even silence into song. "I love you, Rose Morrison," he said into the star-filled darkness. "And I love you, Jake Morrison," she replied, "for all the music you've brought into my life, and all the music we're going to make together." As if summoned by their words, a mockingbird began to sing somewhere in the darkness, a complex melody that seemed to celebrate the night and the love it held and the infinite possibility of tomorrow. Jake and Rose Morrison sat on their porch swing and listened to the music of home, grateful beyond words for the broken truck and the answered prayer that had brought them together. And in the silence between the notes, they heard the sound of a future being written, one song at a time. If you like this story, leave your opinion in the comments and, of course, leave a like and subscribe. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Big hug and see you soon.